all for coming. I'm delighted to be here and to be part of this symposium. And I have lots of pictures and lots of recordings. So let's, whoops, why is it locked? All right, now what? Jared? I can't unlock it because I'm not a user. It was on 5 minutes ago. Thank you. Great. All right. The presence of music in modern society is so ubiquitous that it's something that we take for granted. It's everywhere around us, and we don't even notice it. It's something like oral wallpaper. To Americans in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, music was not quite so omnipresent, but it was a lot more commonplace than many of us realize. My task this afternoon is to show you that music functioned as an important component in the lives of Americans from that historical period to an extent that might surprise some of us. Because this period was before the exponential growth of the middle class, the creation and expansion of the country's transportation system, and of course before the advent of recorded sound. But music and musicians have always had an important part of American social and cultural life. And a clear understanding of that helps us to comprehend better the lives of Americans who lived in an earlier time period. An examination of the place of music in society is usually accomplished by scrutinizing the lives and activities of practicing musicians, or of people who loved music and collected instruments, collected sheet music, or who commented on music in letters and diaries. This was not the case with James Monroe. He was neither an accomplished musician nor someone who sought out music. He never mentioned musicians in his publication or in his writings. Nevertheless, he still had a life that was full of music. I'm focusing today on Monroe for obvious reasons. He's the subject of this symposium, but the fact that Monroe was not a musician or an avowed music lover actually works to my advantage. It's easy, for example, to describe the music-filled life of Monticello, but similarly easy to assume that someone like Jefferson, who was an accomplished violinist, might have been rather extraordinary in his love of music. If I can demonstrate, however, that music was important in the life of a non-musician, like Monroe, then my overall argument that music was ubiquitous in the lives of Americans of this period is somehow more convincing. Monroe, of course, was not your average man on the street. He was wealthy, and of course, he was a prominent statesman. But music, much of the music that he heard was normal, everyday, regular music that was accessible to Americans of all economic and social classes. And even the music he encountered as a statesman was public music. Furthermore, the music he was exposed to as a member of the gentry was undoubtedly typical for Americans of the middle and upper classes. All of these styles, I should hasten to point out, were music that was utilitarian. In other words, it was music that was pleasurable, it was for consumption. It was not music that was edifying or meant to be thought about or create a sense of the sublime. That would come in the 19th century. In contrast, this was music that was formulaic, it was normal, it was to be consumed. In fact, it was popular music at the time. In my paper this afternoon, I'll give you a whirlwind tour of the types of music that made up Monroe's soundscape throughout his entire life, as an example of the type of music that was commonplace in the 18th and early 19th centuries. I'll divide my information into 3 different categories. First, music that was part of Monroe's life as a child and as a young man. This was everyday music that was that everybody encountered. Some examples include children's nursery rhymes and lullabies, ballads and fiddle music, music of Africans and African-American slaves on his family farm, and dance music that he learned as a young man. Then when he went to the college, he encountered music, including drinking songs, makes sense, concert music, and music in the church. When he left the college to join the Continental Army, he encountered music of the military. That's music of his young years. The second category includes ceremonial music that Monroe would have heard as a public servant, as governor, ambassador, president. These include marches and other music for parades, music in special occasions, and songs and toasts that were part of official dinners. My third category, that is music of the gentry, which is the social class to which he and his family belong, include dance music, like what he had learned as a child and that he knew throughout his entire life, concert and theater music that he heard in Philadelphia, Charleston, New York, and elsewhere, and parlor music, compositions published in sheet music that his wife and his two daughters collected, played, and performed in the Monroe home. We'll start with Monroe's youth and his adolescence. What kinds of music might young James Monroe have known while growing up in the 1760s on his family's farm in Westmoreland County, Virginia? My first category is music of the Anglo-American tradition. Examples include nursery songs, like Ring Around the Rosie, or London Bridge is Falling Down. Another category is lullabies, like Hush-a-Bye Baby or Hush Little Baby, or Rock-a-Bye Baby or Hush Little Baby, which were actually published in this publication of songs from Mother Goose's Melodies, published in London in 1860, and we think that it was available here in the colonies. I won't sing these, you know these songs, right? Rock-a-Bye Baby, the Treetop? Right, okay. All right, so you're familiar. The second example is Anglo-American work songs and dance music. Although he was a member of the gentry, he surely knew and was acquainted with a lot of people who were not of his social class, like indentured servants, sailors and soldiers, small farmers, hired help, and laborers, skilled and unskilled, like blacksmiths and carpenters. Most of these people shared the culture of Great Britain. Many, but not all of them, were illiterate and remained uneducated when they came to this country. Their music included Scotch, Irish, or English traditional tunes, either in their original versions or in Americanized versions. Many laborers of this nature sang while they worked. For example, up here in the left-hand corner, we have people who are pounding on an anvil. That type of repetitive work lends itself quite well to rhythmic work songs, call and response work songs. I didn't bring an example of this because I have lots of other examples, but you can imagine, for example, a sea shanty. Everybody knows sea shanties. That type of a work song would work very well in this kind of labor. People of this social class also use dance music for their recreation and entertainment. They entertained themselves this way. This music was also mostly from Great Britain. It was part of the oral tradition. The music was mostly, the dances were mostly reels and hornpipes. There were also jigs. The music itself is generally sectional. I'm going to use not technical terms for music, but I'll be describing certain aspects of it. For example, in a march or a dance like this, it's very frequent to have one melodic strain, the A strain, which is then repeated. Same thing again. Then a B strain, which is then repeated. And in this case, a fiddle tune like this would be that way. It would be repeated over and over again until the dance is over with. Frequently, the fiddler would be embellishing, decorating the melody the second and third time around. Otherwise, it's boring as ditch water. So what I'm going to play is one example. This is called Soldier's Joy. It's a well-known fiddle tune, even in the oral tradition today. It was well-known in the colonies and in the United States. Can you hear that okay? That's the A strain, A again. B. B again. Back to A. I think you get the idea. A second category is music of African and African American slaves. As a young man growing up in the South, Monroe surely heard the songs of the African American slaves on his family's farm. Here you see musicians playing banjo and drums. I've got to find my place here. The enslaved peoples used traditional instruments like the banjo and drum. Here's an example. I'm trying to not do the feedback. Here's an example of a banjo, a drawing of a banjo, and here is one on the next page of a drum. Much of the music was influenced by the musical style of Africa, which included rhythmic complexity, lots of layers of rhythm, the use of short, repeated melodic snippets, kind of like what we just heard in the dance music, and the performance practice of call and response, someone calling out, singing a line, being responded to by the group. This is quite traditional African style. I should point out that the black spiritual that we all know really didn't emerge until later in the 19th century. So the music that we're talking about here is not really, it's like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Young Monroe surely heard regular work songs played, sung by these individuals. Again, the idea is to take a work song, have a call and response pattern, make up verses as you go along, but it's keeping the rhythm going on the work, and it's also making a tedious task kind of bearable. This is an example. It's called Carrie Bell. It's from the Georgia Sea Island Singers. It's an example of a stevedore song, and you'll hear within the performance kind of a huh sound, where that's where the hoisting part of the rope is happening. You'll hear the example of call and response, although this tune is so well known to the performers that many of the singers are singing also the call part in addition to the response part.
Hey there, come on. Your king and cry.
Call, response.
Oh no, you gonna hurt nobody. Oh no, I'm gonna carry through that.
Next verse. And people could make up verse after verse, keeping this going for a long time, which is quite typical. Slaves also danced for recreation and entertainment. This is an 18th century painting, and we see here both the banjar, the bones, which become important in minstrelsy, and a fiddle. So Africans and African American slaves, many of them learned Western instruments, and a characteristic, that is, if someone played a Western instrument, that became an identifying characteristic in lots of runaway slave ads, as you see here. It makes fiddles and can play upon the fiddle, and so forth. That's one reason we know that so many of them played Western instruments. Now, we have very little information about what musical training young Monroe might have had as a child, but it was not uncommon for wealthy Tidewater Virginians to have musical tutors. The most famous example, of course, is Philip Vickers Fithian, who left a journal about his experiences as a tutor to the children of Robert Carter at Nominai Hall, which is about 30 miles from the Monroe farm. Now, Fithian's diary covers the years 1773 to 1774, when James was about 15 years old. The Monroes did not occupy the same social circles as the Carters, but Fithian's comments nevertheless illustrate the importance of music on a plantation and the importance of dancing on a plantation. For example, in 1773, he described a social event at Nominai Hall. When the candles were lighted, he wrote, we all repaired into the dancing room. First, each couple danced a minuet, then all joined as before in the country dances. These continued until 7:30 in the morning, right? I should point out that the musicians who were playing for such dances were usually the slaves on the plantations, which is why they knew Western instruments. All young gentlemen and ladies of Monroe's social class were expected to learn to dance correctly. Oh, I've lost my pictures. There we go. He surely would have encountered music in this guise as a youngster, and would carry this experience and this familiarity with dance music throughout his entire life. Monroe left home in the summer of 1774 to go to the College of William and Mary. He spent about 18 months in Williamsburg, and the bustling capital of the colony must have seemed quite cosmopolitan and worldly to the 16-year-old. While he was a student at the college, he listened to, heard, was exposed to rousing traditional songs, drinking songs in the taverns, sung by, one would hope, the older college students and the many soldiers who were in Williamsburg during the spring and summer of 1775. A good example of this kind of music would be a song called Nottingham Ale.
The spring
Yeah, the soloist singing the verse.
But Marcus, they tell us that prince of good fellows was Jupiter's son, great in my tale. And those that must patter mistake quite the matter. He sprang from a barrel of
And then the rest of the group joins in on the chorus. Imagine as the evening went on, people got drunker and drunker, and the singing got rowdier and rowdier. And I cannot imagine someone like Monroe or anybody not joining in. It was traditional, in fact, for many taverns at this time to have fiddles hanging on the wall that someone who could play could take down and play for entertainment purposes. While he was in Williamsburg, young Monroe also probably heard some of the more elevated music that was organized by Peter Pelham, who was the major professional musician in Williamsburg during this time. Pelham kept a copybook during this period, which included pieces by some important contemporary European composers, such as a gavotte by Mr. Handel, George Friedrich Handel. Pelham also wrote dances himself. For example, this minuet, which he wrote. We see here just the treble line. That's all he wrote out. It was just assumed that the musicians would improvise the bass or an accompaniment, or this may be just played by solo fiddle. Both of these compositions, the gavotte and the minuet, suggest that there were more elevated or genteel styles of dances in addition to the more uprousing jigs of the country folk going on in town at the time. This is an example of this piece played on violin with accompaniment by mandolin and guitar. We're right here, for those of you who read music. It would normally repeat AA, but I've started at the second A. Going to the B section here. Back to A. And then it would go on, repeats with lots of improvisation and so forth. In fact, on this recording, it's repeated 3 times, different each time, which you have to make it work with the dance. During this period, I should point out that Pelham also organized performances of concertos by composers like Vivaldi and Handel in town. He mentions those. There's mention of those in a letter. We don't know if young Monroe encountered this music or went to any of these concerts, but surely he was aware of its existence. Mention of Pelham provides a good segue to another category, sacred music, because Pelham was the organist of Bruton Parish Church for over 40 years. As a student at a church-based college, Monroe certainly attended services on Sundays. The congregation at Bruton Parish would have sung versifications of the Psalms, found in psalters like this, the whole book of Psalms. This is called the Sternhold and Hopkins, and we know that Robert Carter owned a copy of this when he lived in Williamsburg in the 1760s, so it was in town. They would have sung the harmonizations in this book, or they might have sung the harmonization, but they might have sung the psalm as a simple, unharmonized recitation of the song in what is known as lining out fashion. This is an old-fashioned style of singing, and I have an example of it. I've chosen for an example a tune called Old Hundredth, which is a setting of the 100th Psalm and is familiar today as the doxology. We'll hear it in lining out fashion.
Make ye a joyful sounding noise. Make ye a joyful sounding noise unto Jehovah all the earth. Unto Jehovah all the earth. Serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Serve ye Jehovah with gladness. Before his
surprised. Anyway, it's still known today. I should point out that although this is an old-fashioned style of performance, in fact, it is a professional performance by trained singers. And most of the recordings I'm using will be by professional musicians and are higher quality than we could have ever expected to hear in the 18th century. But that's the way it goes. I have a couple of amateur performances to lend realism to my talk. Bruton Parrish installed his first organ in 1855. It's probably similar to the 1740 English country organ that is currently in the Wren Chapel at the College of William and Mary. And organists like Pelham would frequently play psalms, but then improvise or play extemporaneous sections in between the lines of the psalm. I've chosen as an example a piece that is from Daniel Purcell's collection of such compositions. It is actually of Old Hundredth, and you'll hear the psalm line, and then kind of sound like noodling, but in fact this music is written out. And we do know that Pelham owned a copy of Daniel Purcell's composition, his publication. Can you folks hear this? Okay. Second line. This is being played by Jock Darling on that organ. That gives you a good idea. Monroe left William and Mary in January '76 to join the Continental Army, where his life, like the lives of all people in the military, was regulated by music, which I suspect you probably don't know. Fife and drum corps, usually 2 fifers and 2 drummers per company, played marches to help the soldiers get from one place to another. In fact, the speed of a march, the speed at which soldiers can get from point A to point B, was predicated on the tempo of the march that was chosen to accompany the marching. This is an example called the Long March, part of an example. A again, you notice? B. Back to A. In battle, the musicians functioned as communication, informing soldiers when to go forward, advance, retreat, cease fire, and so forth. Here are the musicians in this 1897 painting. An example of such a tune is Cease Fire, which is short and to the point, and repeated until the soldiers stop firing. Was also entirely regulated by music. The fifers and drummers regularly played brief, repetitive duty tunes that had specific meanings. For example, waking up soldiers in the morning, or calling them to breakfast with a tune called Peas Upon the Trencher, or telling them when to fall back into rank, drummers call, when to report back to camp, tattoo, and when to go to dinner with a tune called Roast Beef of Old England. This is what a reveille sounds like. Think of this as you're sleeping, it's 4:30 in the morning, and this is what you hear. There's no snooze button. I'll bet that a lot of soldiers wanted to shoot the fifers and the drummers. Soldiers heard this music over and over again. They knew the music backwards and forwards, and they never forgot it. And Monroe was in uniform for 6 years, so you better believe he knew this music. When Monroe left the Army at the end of 1781, he entered upon a political career that would span the rest of his life, as we've heard this morning. It would take him, of course, to the highest office in the country. He also became an attorney, and he married and started a family. In 1786, he married Elizabeth Courtwright, the daughter of a prominent New York City merchant. They would have 3 children, 2 would reach adulthood. Given Monroe's status in life, it is not surprising that the most common music he may have heard in this position was official ceremonial music. Monroe wouldn't have heard the Marine Band playing Hail to the Chief because that tune, which we all know today, was not associated with a living president until 1829. But he would have heard pieces like this Monroe March, or this march dedicated to Colonel Monroe, or President Monroe's Inauguration March by the Irish immigrant Peter Moran, or President Monroe's March for Piano by Stephen Christiani of Philadelphia. Most of this music was published in sheet music form for piano. The pieces are generally quite simple. The same kind of format that I've already mentioned, A, A, B, B, and so forth, is repetitive, is appropriate for a march or for a dance. This is a performance of Christiani's march on Monroe's piano, which is in the collection at the Monroe Museum. B section. Monroe would also have regularly heard music throughout his public career at dinners, given to mark special occasions like the 4th of July, or his return from Europe, or Jefferson's election to the presidency. Such dinners always required a series of toasts. The toast would be made, the participants would drink it down, the whole glass. So if there's 20 toasts before dinner, you know, they're pretty sloshed by the time dinner comes around. The musicians would play a tune if there were musicians there, or people would sing, or both. There's no firm evidence that Monroe actually participated in the singing, but I cannot imagine that he did not. He would have been considered rather odd if he just sat there. There is one quotation or mention of a participant noticing that the president was keeping tune to the music with his fork. So we do with what we have. People composed songs expressly for such occasions. They also frequently wrote new words to familiar tunes. A good example is when Monroe was in Paris in 1795. He hosted a dinner, and at the dinner, this text, written by a citizen of the United States, was sung to the tune of To Anacreon in Heaven. The lyrics are quite celebratory, rather bombastic. How many of you know what this British drinking tune, To Anacreon in Heaven, is?
Star Spangled Banner.
Yes, so it would go, each patriot bosom re-echoes the strain, and cordial philanthropy heightens the chorus. Everybody is singing, right? While magical fancy o'erleaps the proud main, and places our friends and our country before us, etc. You get the idea. This is not uncommon. Ceremonial music was usually patriotic or military in nature. Sometimes, however, it kind of slipped over into the area that we call art music today. As an example, Monroe was again in Paris in 1804. We've already seen this picture, but we'll see it again. This was Napoleon's coronation as emperor. He attended the ceremonies at which he heard music composed for the service. There are several pieces that we know were composed for it and performed: a solemn coronation mass by the Italian composer Giovanni Paisiello, and 2 fairly serious choral works by the French composer Jean-François Lisieux and Abbé Mourzet. I couldn't find any recordings of these, but believe me, they're ceremonial choral compositions. All of these types of music, except maybe this ceremonial solemn mass, were also abundant during Monroe's 3 official national tours. The first was in the summer of 1817 of the northern states. The second, in the spring of 1818, was of the Chesapeake Bay region, and the third, in the spring or summer of 1819, of the southern and some western states. Now, this was the first time that a sitting president had, since 1791, that a president had traveled around the country. And what was started out as an exploratory inspection tour turned into grand celebrations. People turned out by the thousands to see and greet the president. They greeted him with parades, with speeches, with dinners, special performances, balls, and with compositions in his honor. Frequently, bands performed marches like this one, The bands that performed for him would have been made up of brass and wind instruments, and local band directors would take music like this, which is for piano, and transcribe it make different parts for their various instruments in their ensembles. An example is President Monroe's March, written by the French emigre composer Eugene Guilbert of Charleston, South Carolina. And we're going to hear a performance that was arranged from the sheet music by University of Mary Washington faculty member David Long. That's the A string. We're going to hear it again, right? This is music that was meant for consumption. Now the B section, we'll hear just a little bit of it. Music heard during the tours is also frequently mentioned in reports from various towns. In Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for example, a splendid arch was erected, tastefully decorated, on which was stationed a band of music, who struck up the President's March as he passed under it. When he arrived at Pittsburgh, the band played on the boat that carried him across the Ohio River. And in Concord, New Hampshire, the young gentleman who composed the band of instrumental music, understanding that the President would leave town at 5:30 in the morning, took liberty to awaken him at 4:30 by playing a few airs and marches under his window. It must have brought back memories of revelry in the military. He must have been delighted in this. Monroe received a special honor at Fort Independence in Boston Harbor when a garrison band performed President Monroe's Trumpet March, written especially for the occasion by a member of the ensemble. Another very different kind of special performance given for Monroe while he was on tour was a select oratorio by the Venerable Handel and Haydn Society of Boston in July 1817. They performed a President Monroe's March by a local composer and a large work which was a combination of vocal selections taken from pieces written by both Handel and Haydn. In fact, the first part, which we see right here, is actually from Judas Maccabeus, an oratorio by Handel, which is very celebratory in nature. It's a duet followed by a chorus. What the part I'm going to play is the very end of the duet going into the chorus. You'll see that it's quite appropriate for a celebration. Words, but you get the idea. It's a wonderful performance. I can't imagine the Handel and Haydn Society in the early 19th century sounded anywhere that good, but it gives you an idea. We don't know how familiar Monroe was with music of this nature, but surely he knew some of it. The works of Handel and Haydn were quite well known in both Europe and the United States. He surely knows something like the Alleluia chorus from Messiah, which is actually the piece that this performance ended with. Another very different kind of performance, an example of the kind of song that ordinary citizens wrote to honor the President is this celebratory ode from Charleston, South Carolina. A man named Oliver Lyon penned lyrics to a melody written by Jacob Eckert that clearly indicates local pride. Let all with joyful hearts appear, behold, our country's chief is here. Bid welcome to our shores, our guide, Monroe, Columbia's boast and pride. They were clearly tickled to death that the President had come to their town. Some pieces written in honor of Monroe were dances, like this waltz, for piano. Some were like a march, which had extra parts for violin or flute. The most unusual ceremonial music that Monroe witnessed while he was president was a dance by a delegation of Pawnee Indians during a visit to Washington in 1821. This style of music, which was called primitive at the time, was unlike anything else that Americans heard. Americans were not familiar with it very much at all. What I have here is a recording from a contemporary powwow. I want you to listen to a couple of things. One is the call and response, the importance of percussion, including percussion on clothing. For example, on the leggings here, those are percussion instruments like shells that are rattling while the dancers are dancing. And the harsh attack, the vocal attack, is characteristic of Native American music. One thing that is very different in this recording from what we see here, or what would be appropriate in the 1820s, is we have women and men singing. That would not have been the case in the 1820s. This is from a contemporary powwow. You notice I had the call and response. Now they're all going to sing. Back to call and response. And it goes on for quite a long time. For my final category of music I'll discuss this afternoon, I'll return to James Monroe's family. This time the family he created, not the one in which he grew up, which is where I started. The style of music that I'll end with this afternoon, like that I discussed at the very beginning, was everyday music of Americans. But this time it's the American gentry. In other words, the landed gentry of the South, or the attorneys, merchants, doctors, or other professionals, people in the professional classes everywhere else, including the South. The most important social activities of this class of people included dancing, attendance at the theater, and music making in private parlors. Now, I've already mentioned the fact that James Monroe, like all members of the gentry, learned how to dance as a young man. There's a clear assumption that he continued doing this throughout his life. He was a regular, normal, red-blooded American man, and he would have been considered quite odd if he hadn't danced. We know a little bit less about his attitude towards the theater, but we do have some information that I'll discuss. We know a fair amount, however, about the place of music in the Monroe private home and in the homes of their friends and acquaintances. We'll start with the theater. You might question my assertion about the importance of the theater to Americans of the 18th and 19th century, because today live theatrical performances are pretty much an elite activity. But Americans of the 18th and throughout the 19th century attended theatrical performances quite regularly and absolutely casually, more akin to what the attitude we'd have about heading down to the multiplex to watch a film. The overwhelming draw of the theater is suggested, for example, by the fact that when Monroe attended a performance in Charleston, South Carolina in April 1819, 1,800 Charlestonians stormed the theater to be there with him. It must have been packed in this theater. Theater audiences were segregated economically and socially. Theaters were built with separate entrances for different social classes. Upper, middle, and lower classes, including slaves, could watch and enjoy the same performances safely seated in their segregated parts of the house, as is illustrated by this Hogarth engraving. Theatrical experience of the period was quite different than today. The house lights were not dimmed. It's rather hard to dim a candle. Frequent conversation occurred among audience members, as we kind of see in this engraving. People got up and moved around. They ate. Here they're eating apples, it looks like. They yelled at actors on the stage. It's more akin, I think, today to attendance at an athletic event where you yell and scream and cheer and so forth. It's much more like that than our very staid idea of going to the theater today. An evening's entertainment generally stretched out for 4, sometimes 6 hours. There was a great deal of variety. You started out with a main piece, which is a drama or an opera, followed by an afterpiece, which is like a farce or a comic opera. In between these two, you would have some kind of a varied entertainment, a juggler, a singer, acrobat, dancer, and so forth. The house orchestra, whether it was a harpsichord and a violin or a real ensemble of instruments, played intermittently or more frequently throughout the entire evening, starting with the overture, Then they would play during and between the acts of the main piece. They would accompany the varied entertainment. They would play during the after piece, and they'd end up with some kind of an after postlude or something like that. Clearly, music held the whole thing together. Also, clearly, the whole potpourri of entertainment was much more akin to us sitting in front of the TV watching a whole series of Netflix shows, getting up, going to the bathroom, getting something to eat, answering the phone, coming back, then to going to the theater, which we think of as an elite entertainment today. Every theater had an orchestra. I've circled the musicians. This is Drury Lane Theatre in London. It's bigger than any theater in America at the time, but it's very typical in this layout. Here we have the pit, where people of the middling classes would sit on backless benches, and the upper classes in the boxes that are at the periphery of the theater, musicians separating the pit from the actors. Now, getting back to James Monroe and his family, what do we know about their familiarity with the theater? He was not an inveterate theater goer like George Washington was. He didn't collect playbills, and he almost never mentioned exciting performances in the theater in any of his writings. There is, in fact, surprisingly little information about his theatrical tastes. But during the years when he and his family lived in cities, or when he visited cities on his tours, he attended theatrical performances. If he had ignored them, like not dancing, he would have been considered a social misfit. A published program of one performance that Monroe attended is a good example of theatrical life he knew. In June 1817, in New York, he attended a performance at the Park Theater. Here's the Park Theater, exterior, 1821, and the interior a year later. You see it's smaller than Drury Lane, but it is the same kind of layout. There's the boxes, there's the pit, there's the stage, there's the musicians, and there is a close-up of the musicians. Now, in this particular evening, we have the main piece, which is Macbeth, and the after piece, which is called Sprigs of Laurel, by the prominent English composer William Shield. As far as I know, the music to Sprigs of Laurel does not survive, but Shield's works were very well known in the colonies and also in the early United States. His opera, Rosina, was one of the most popular works on the American stage. And I'll play a bit of one song from Rosina, just to give you a taste of what theatrical music of the time sounded like. What I'm going to play is a soprano being accompanied by a fortepiano. It's not an orchestra, but it gives you a sense. This is a strophic song. It's in song from AABA. Works, there was a performance of a naval song, which was called Rise Columbia Brave and Free, which has a rabble-rousing patriotic text, which was probably sung in honor of Monroe's presence at the theater. Music of the stage provides a segue to my final section, that is music in the parlor, because stage songs were frequently published as sheet music, and young men and young women avidly collected music. Music making was clearly a normal activity in the Monroe household, just as it was in the households of most Americans of the gentry. Although Monroe did not play a musical instrument, his wife, Elizabeth, and his two daughters most assuredly did. Over the years, the Monroes owned several pianos. There's mention of one piano in the household when the Monroes lived in Fredericksburg. A piano was purchased in Paris in 1794. There's mention in Monroe's account book of paying to have people move a piano from Albemarle County to Richmond in 1802. They owned a square piano manufactured by George Astor in London in 1806. This is an example of what the piano may have looked like in the parlor. This is at Ashland-on-Highland, and it is a George Astor piano that does not play. It's not playable anymore. It was donated to Ashland-on-Highland by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. But it's the same years, same appearance as the 1806 Astor piano. Monroe purchased also in 1817 a piano, an Erard grand piano for the White House. This is a much larger, more elegant instrument and looks much closer to what we think of as a grand piano today. I couldn't find a color photograph, but that would do. The Astor Square piano was from the shop of an instrument builder who was popular in the United States. This is the Astor piano. This is at the Monroe Museum. It's the same. It is actually Monroe's piano, and it's the same piano we heard played earlier. And I have a short video of the same University of Mary Washington student who played before, playing another Monroe march. And let's see if it will actually work. Oh, it's working. A again. Now B. B again. And back to A. We'll stop there. The fact that the Monroes purchased a whole series of instruments over a 14-year period tells us something about their interest in the instrument. The piano was developing during this time, it was undergoing a lot of changes, manufacturers were creating different things, and it's clear that the Monroes wanted to have the most recent model that was available. Monroe was very interested in the education of his two daughters, Eliza and Maria. He wanted them to be intelligent and well-informed as well as accomplished. And learning to play a musical instrument was a prominent part of their education. Eliza had piano lessons when they lived in Richmond, and Monroe ordered sheet music from Paris for her. When they lived in Paris, Eliza attended a select boarding school where music was part of the education, and Monroe wrote about this a bit later when he was in London. He described what her previous education had been, and then continued by describing what happened when she moved to London. That in fact, our daughter is now with us, attended by a musician and pursuing her studies with advantage. Several years later, in an 1805 letter to his daughter, he reminded her that one of the accomplishments she should pursue as a proper young lady was perfecting the art of playing and singing several airs on the harp. He also promised, "I will get you one at Paris," and continued, "That is an accomplishment that will be really useful to you." His younger daughter, Maria, also played the piano, and when she attended school in Philadelphia, she created a binder's volume of sheet music, which is an absolutely normal activity for a young American woman of the gentry, of the middle or the upper classes. This document is at the Monroe Museum here in Fredericksburg. The collection of 33 pieces includes both instrumental and piano vocal works from the theater, such as this song, "The Conquest of Toronto," as performed at the Theatre Royal Covent Garden, or this one from an operatic romance called "The Devil's Bridge," or this aria from an Italian comic opera, which is incorrectly attributed to Mozart, which is transcribed not for piano vocal, but for piano variations, for actually either harp or piano. Both daughters played the harp, and the collection, Maria's collection, includes several pieces for harp or piano, or just for harp. And I have a recording of a harp, but I don't have this piece, but you'll have to make do with what... So I want you to hear what a harp sounded like at the time. This is actually from Tom Moore's melodies. There are several examples of Tom Moore melodies in the collection. Very quiet, kind of ethereal sound. There are also songs in the collection, and marches, and dances. The very first piece in the volume is this Brazilian waltz with optional parts for other instruments like clarinet, flute, flageolet, which is a kind of a flute, or violin. Now, I've already mentioned the popularity of dancing in the 18th century. Dancing occurred regularly in American parlors during this period and throughout the entire 19th century. In fact, the American Ladies Pocketbook, an annual magazine published in Philadelphia, included 2 dances in his 1818 edition that honored the first couple, Mrs. Monroe's Waltz and the President's Waltz. The instructions are appropriate for parlor dancing. This piece from Maria's volume is a waltz composed by the same Peter Moran, who wrote the President's inaugural march I mentioned above. The publisher of this piece was quite savvy because he wrote it for theme and variations, which is very popular for amateurs, and also for a combination of instruments. And I want to play an example of this piece to give you my last example, my last musical example. This is played by Haydn. It's on the Monroe piano. B section. If you notice the timbre, the color of this sound is very much like the harp. And it's very different sounding than the earlier recordings I used, in part because they were recorded in different rooms, so the acoustics were quite different. Family members also heard music in the homes of others. Friends and family members frequently played with and for each other. For example, when Monroe visited the home of a friend in North Carolina in 1818, the daughter of the family, who was described as a beautiful and accomplished young maiden, willingly entertained the party after early tea till bedtime by some of her best airs on the harp, an instrument on which she excelled, accompanied by a sweet, well-trained voice. Several years before this, when Monroe visited Boston, a band full of music enlivened the gala at the home of Boston attorney George Blake, and at a reception he attended at a private home in Portland, Maine, the younger part of the company had formed a party and enjoyed a beautiful evening by a dance under the piazza. The amount of known information about music in Monroe's life is fairly significant. He was, after all, an important historical figure. But the fact that he enjoyed such a rich musical life, even though he apparently was not himself a music, or did not apparently seek out music, further suggests that this type of musical activity was not uncommon for many Americans who were not of his social status, or who were prominent enough to have their records survive. I have mentioned a wide variety of musical styles and genres, ranging from oral tradition music of natives, of whites, of blacks, music for dance, concerts, the church, the military, ceremonial music for a public servant, music in the theater, and amateur music making in the home. There are other things I haven't mentioned, but I think it would be gilding the lily to go on, besides I'm out of time. Music in American life at this period was actually quite ubiquitous. It was also rich and interesting. And I hope that in the future, when you think about American society or the culture of an earlier period, you will remember what I've shared with you today. Music was part of that culture. It was no less important to Americans then than it is to Americans today. Thank you. Do we have time for a few questions, even though I'm a little bit late? We started late.
Yeah, we have time. Go ahead.
Okay, questions? Somebody, please.
I have a comment, not a quite, well,
Question, yes,
no,
please.
real question.
You said they segregated by economic level.
Mhm.
I was wondering if that was primarily by the pricing of the tickets and what they sold.
Yeah, pricing of tickets. And that goes on until about the middle of the 19th century, when you start to see opera houses, what they called opera houses, or theaters that changed the pit, which was for the middling or lower classes, although the slaves and apprentices would be up in the very top in the gallery. They changed that to what's called the parquet. And now that's what we think today as the most important and best seats in the house. But in the 18th century and early 19th century, that's the wealthy did not go there at all. So, but yeah, the prices were quite different. And I think, a woman would never go down in the pit. That would just be besmirch her reputation completely. Unless you're a lower class woman. But generally, women are in the galleries, in the boxes, in the circumference of the theater. Yes?
I was interested when I just found or learned that the first fife and drum band, it was like 2 guys.
Oh, it's not the
Used it.
first. It's just that normally.
Used at BMI was rented slaves from a slave owner.
Okay, that makes
And
sense.
I just wondered, has there been a study done to how many of the the fifers and drummers than the people used for the military signals of all sorts in the Revolutionary War were slaves?
I have no idea, but that's an interesting idea. I didn't mean to suggest that the first fife and drum were slaves. I mean, were one and were two, a fifer and a drummer, but just that each company would have one fifer and one drummer. So if you go to Colonial Williamsburg and you watch the Fife and Drum Corps march down the street, 30 people strong or 50 people strong, that represents a bunch of companies coming together, and all the fifers and drummers performing as a unit.
Well,
Okay.
as far as I have read, there were only those two guys at VMI, at least at first.
There were only two guys for each company, yes.
No, I mean at VMI.
Oh, VMI, okay.
Yeah.
Don't know about VMI.
Yeah, I mean,
No
I thought
idea.
it was,
Yeah.
I just didn't realize it would be borrowed slaves.
Yeah, could be, yes. Heidi?
Where did you find the sketch of the djembe, the African drum? I'm sorry.
I could tell you, but I don't remember off the top of my head. It's at Colonial Williamsburg.
Okay.
I can give you the citation. Yeah. Didn't write it down, so yeah. I think it's early 19th century from a journal. But if you want to know, I'll send it to you. Yeah. Other questions? You had a comment.
I just wanted to comment that thanks to Heidi's cooperation and that of the music department at UMW, the museum is hoping by Christmas time to have out a CD of music of Monroe's era played on our Astor pianoforte, and possibly augmented with some other vocal performances as well as the instrumental playing by Heidi. So stay tuned.
So would it be performances of Maria's Binder's Line?
Heidi?
There are 4 or 5 pieces out of Maria's book,
Okay.
and a couple of other pieces, J.S. Bach specifically.
J.S. Bach would not have been known very well in the 18th century.
Okay.
You said J.S. Bach, really?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm losing the name of the other composer that we used, and then mixed in. I think we talked about doing some vocal pieces out of Maria's book as well.
I'm sorry, the last part you said?
Then some vocal pieces out of Maria's book as well.
Okay,
We were
okay.
trying to work.
I'm reacting about Bach because Bach's music was not known in concert at all. It was,
No, we did it. Just it sounded good on the pianoforte.
got it, okay. Any other questions?
We're doing Freebird too.
All right. Okay, thank you so much.